All right, welcome everyone tonight. My name is Becky Allen. I'm the Executive Director of the Linden Hills Neighborhood Council, also known as LHiNC. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. On this beautiful night, we were just commenting on how beautiful it is. So I really want to thank you even more so for joining us. This will be the third talk in an ongoing series that's co-hosted by LHiNC and the Minneapolis Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. Michelle Rivero is the director of that office, and she's here tonight as our facilitator. So a big thank you to her for sharing her time and expertise once again. She's been here with us for all of our talks. Michelle, their office, and LHiNC started these talks over the summer in order to bring some attention and awareness to the critical issues facing the immigrant and refugee community here in Minnesota and in Minneapolis. And we have been discussing organizations that are doing the critical work and how we can get involved in that work. And so that brings us to our speaker tonight, also Michelle. So we have two Michelles tonight, Michele Garnett McKenzie from Advocates for Human Rights. She is the Deputy Director and Director of Advocacy there. She joined the organization as an attorney representing asylum seekers and detained immigrants, and later managed the organization's Immigration Legal Services Program. Today, she works to document and report on human rights issues and is the author of publications on human trafficking and immigrant rights. So we are so thrilled to have both of them with us tonight to talk about these important issues. Just a few etiquette rules to get out of the way. Please stay on mute if you can, so that we cut down on background noise. There will be many opportunities throughout the night for question and answer. So please feel free at those times to either use the hand raising function or to post questions in the chat that we can then relay to the Michelles. Thank you again all for being here. And I'm going to hand things off now to Michelle Rivero.
Super. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this conversation today. I'm very grateful for the interest of the neighborhood organization in this important work. I just want to very briefly talk about the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs and what it does, and then talk a little bit about the relationship with the Advocates for Human Rights, and then kind of turn to federal immigration changes. We'll spend some time talking about state legislation and specific ways that members of the community can get involved in immigration advocacy. So the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs was established in July of 2018, really with the purpose of ensuring that our elected officials, our city staff, and perhaps most importantly, our community members are aware of immigration-related developments and the impact that those developments have on our immigrant, refugee, and new American community members. So some of the work that the office does includes participating in conversations like this around the city, and also connecting with residents who are impacted by these immigration changes. During the previous administration, many of those changes were negative, and fortunately, during the current administration, we're seeing a lot of developments that are actually very positive, that have a positive impact on our communities. So the relationship that the city of Minneapolis has with the Advocates for Human Rights is that Advocates is one of our immigration legal service partners. So the city contracts with several organizations. This year has expanded to 4. Including Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, the Advocates Volunteer Lawyers Network, and we expanded to Minnesota Legal Aid with the goal of ensuring that people have access to accurate, competent legal information and advice, up to and including full representation, regardless of ability to pay, recognizing that immigration law is a very complicated area of law. It can be very expensive to hire an immigration attorney, and people need this type of expertise in order to obtain more secure immigration status in the United States. So we're very grateful for our partnership with the Advocates for Human Rights, and perhaps I'll turn it over to Michelle to talk just a little bit more about the work of the advocates before we get into the subjects for this evening.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Becky, for hosting this and LHiNC. It is, it's really, always, it's a challenging time to talk about immigration, right? Because there's so much hope and so much going on, but there's also so much happening every moment. And so I'm really grateful to OIRA to serve as a hub for immigration information for the city. And I know it's just been a tremendous a tremendous investment by the city, and also value that we've all had from having a spearheaded centralized place where we can get information about immigration and developments, and have somebody keeping an eye on things, both the external policies and internally within the cities. The Advocates for Human Rights is a nearly 40-year-old organization. We're based in Minneapolis, and we're a volunteer-driven organization that works on a multitude of human rights issues, including immigration. We've done free immigration legal service work since the early 1980s, when we started working on asylum cases, trying to help people fleeing persecution have a fair day in court as they navigated complex legal proceedings. We continue that work, and as Michelle said, are a partner of the city. We work on free legal services for people fleeing persecution and torture, worked with victims of human trafficking so that people can obtain immigration defenses and not be returned to trafficking situations, and work too much in the last few years on defending people who are detained for removal proceedings. And so I think we'll turn things over. And I guess part of the conversation tonight is really acknowledging the moment we're in, right, Michelle?
So yes, and thank you so much for bringing that up. I do think it's important to recognize the tragic killings that took place in Atlanta on Tuesday that impacted members of the Asian and Pacific Islander community in Atlanta, really reverberations here in Minnesota. I know that these killings have impacted community members here and are of a piece with a lot of the violence and hate motivated actions that have been visited on the API community. So really just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. If individuals who are participating in our forum have things that they would like to share, or Michelle, if there's anything that you would like to say on that subject, to open the floor.
Yeah, thanks. I think for us, one of the other areas that we've spent a great deal of time, many years working on, is ending violence against women. And the killings in Atlanta really show that intersection. I think Georgia State Representative Wynn talked about the intersection of gender-based violence, misogyny, and xenophobia in one package here. And it's I think important that we also recognize the toll that is taken by violence against women, and the number of women who are killed by intimate partners or in attacks like this. Every hour, 6 women are murdered by a man in the United States or somewhere in the world. And, you know, it's really just a very sobering intersection. So thanks for.
Thank you. I almost feel like a moment of silence is in order, you know?
No, it's just, yeah.
So, you know, moving from that sobering topic, you know, I indicated that in terms of what we were hoping to cover today, there are so many immigration developments at the federal level. I mean, I'm working on my second binder of executive orders, memoranda, proclamations, and not to mention the bills, right, that are pending in Congress. So it does take some time to parse out. We'll address some of that today, but just want people who are listening to know that in conjunction with the City of St. Paul, the City of Minneapolis Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs is holding a weekly forum on Tuesdays at 4:30. to kind of go through things one by one. It's an hour and a half. So if people are interested in learning more than what we covered today on federal developments, that space is available. So perhaps we can start, Michelle, with the headlines, and the border is always a headline, right? Every day. And so I'm wondering, like, what kind of information can you share about the situation at the border, Biden immigration policies relating to entries at the border? What can you share with us?
Yeah, this has been, I think, just an incredibly complex situation for decades. The early, right after the federal law started to recognize that there was a right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution, we had refugees from Central America seeking asylum and being turned back en masse back in the 1980s. It's been a complex relationship with the border community or the border zone and the right to protection from persecution for decades. In the Obama administration, we had seen a real surge in the numbers of unaccompanied children and families with small children fleeing persecution on account of a destabilization in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, in numbers that we hadn't seen for a long time. And we had, I think we all can remember some of the pictures of children in Border Patrol stations and, just kind of being funneled through an immigration enforcement mechanism years ago. That changed who asylum seekers were in Minnesota. We have a very different population today than we did 20 years ago because of that shift. Under the Trump administration, there was just a very concerted effort and a very successful effort to close the border and to not only turn back asylum seekers in violation of international law who were at the border or who were within, had entered the US and were near it, but to also, work with Mexico to really try to apprehend people on the way to the US. A policy called Remain in Mexico, or the Migrant Protection Protocols, as the government talked about, was instituted so that asylum seekers had to stay in Mexico, even while their official immigration cases were pending in the United States. People would actually show up or are showing up for court in like shipping container courtrooms where they are video linked with judges in the United States to do their proceedings from the border. This is kind of absurd turning on its head of due process and justice and safety. And so after the inauguration, President Biden has sought to really ameliorate some of those harsh effects of the border closures. We're talking about tens of thousands of people sitting, in limbo in very dangerous and precarious conditions, waiting for us to give them a day in court. And with that has come a arrival of new asylum seekers. The estimates now are that there are about 14,000 children in custody. They are no longer being summarily turned back at the US border. They had been, children had been pushed back just like grown-ups. There are about 14,000 children who are now in the US seeking asylum. This process is that children are not supposed to be held in jail-like conditions, certainly not in temporary holding cells that Border Patrol operates in the borderlands for more than 72 hours before being turned over to a shelter care system operated by the Department of Health and Human Services. Of course, that has backed up. And so children are in these temporary conditions for longer periods of time than they should be. There's reports of several hundred of the kids are under age 12. So there are some little kids affected. Most of the folks coming are teenagers right now. And it's just going to be, I think, a real balancing act of making sure that everyone is safe, that everyone's rights to seek asylum are protected, that families are reunified. Many of the kids coming to the US actually have family in the United States, and they're trying to get to their parents who've been working here for years and haven't been able to travel back and forth. So making sure reunification happens, creating and really monitoring when children are released and to whom they're released. We don't want kids sitting in detention, but we also don't want to release them to predators. We had Andrea Cedil did a documentary several years ago about children released to traffickers in egg farms in the central part of the United States. It was part of the smuggling operation. So there's real concern about safety, and I think from the public perspective, we need to have our eye on the safety ball and not on trying to speed things up in a way that's unsafe.
I think that's such an important point. And I know that there are probably questions that people have, and I want to make sure that we are getting through a little bit more material on the federal level before opening it up to questions, if that's okay. I know one other subject that is of great interest is a change in deportation priorities. So just want to frame that up by, it's easier to frame it in explaining what things were like before and what things are like now, right? So before January 20th, essentially anyone who was in the United States without authorization was an enforcement priority. So a priority for deportation from removal to the United States. And with the new administration, that is no longer the case, right? So if you can orient us a little bit into what has changed, what the priorities are now, what that means for people who are in the United States, even individuals who are here without authorization.
Yeah, I think it's, this is definitely going to be a work in progress. But on January 20th, a memo was released by the administration, by Secretary Pekoske. That memo put in place some interim enforcement policies, their priorities, kind of returning us to, for me, it sounded kind of like, I don't know, the Clinton era, where priorities for enforcement would be any threats to national security. That's priority one. Priority two would be threats to border security, and that it appears is defined as people who've repeatedly tried to enter the United States recently. So
after January 20th.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, in the November to January.
Or November 20th. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Yep.
Yeah. So that there will be a priority on trying to not have people repeatedly try to enter the United States illegally. And then public safety as priority three, which the Pekoske memo identifies people with aggravated felony convictions. And that's an immigration law term that sweeps a lot of things into it. So the aggravated felony term to normal ears might sound like extremely serious crimes. It does sweep into its orbit things like signing a ticket for a marijuana possession charge in Minneapolis. So it is a very broad definition, but those are our priorities. What we've learned is that that's the interim priority schedule. And so that means that if you're not on that list, ICE, federal immigration authorities are supposed to consider exercises of discretion, like maybe not starting charges against a person at all to deport them, or allowing them to be released from custody if they're in detention, or putting their case on hold while other immigration applications get decided. So it doesn't mean that everybody's home free under those enforcement priorities, but tries to give some direction around how to exercise discretion. What we understand is the field office directors around the country, so we have one here at Fort Snelling, are starting to collect what they're informally calling priority fours, and so where they feel like those priorities 1, 2, and 3 fall short, and that will be informing the formation of permanent guidance. So everything's in play. It really points to some, I think, fundamental disagreement between the ICE union, which believes that any direction on priorities or discretion limits them or puts them at a disadvantage from doing their job, which is 100% enforcement of all immigration laws. And reality, where when we're dealing with law enforcement, we always make discretionary decisions in the rest of the world. So those two are kind of at odds right now. We'll see how it plays out.
And it does seem like ICE has a case review process. At least it seems like that was announced on their website. And if people are interested in the case review process
Right.
for your specific situation, they can.
Right. If there are individual cases, there is a process that we're supposed to use to escalate that and try to keep this all documented, so that in an individual case, we're seeing how discretion plays out.
Okay.
So it's a work in progress. It's much more of a transparent one than under the Obama administration, which I think was more directive to the agency. This is trying to give the agency some buy-in. Hopefully that will keep them engaged and less at loggerheads with the directions.
Super. So let's see, there is so much more to cover, and Michelle, I'm going to let you take your pick. Public charge has been in the news. Venezuelan TPS DED, the restart of the Central American Minors Program, and all the bills at the federal legislative level. So let's hear what you do in like 3 minutes with all of that, or take your pick on what you'd like to focus on.
Well, I think we have to touch on public charge here. There was so much fear generated intentionally by the Trump administration in immigrant communities about the use of any sort of public assistance. And that comes under that category, an old law from the 1880s, part of our exclusion laws to the US, that prohibits people who are likely to become a public charge in the United States from immigrating. And there was very high profile efforts by the Trump administration to expand who would be considered a public charge and therefore fall afoul of immigration rules. Either that meant they couldn't bring a family member in, or they might be at risk of not being able to get a green card or naturalize it. It had all sorts of repercussions. And there were lawsuits filed against regulations that had been promulgated. The administration had a very sweeping regulation that was going into effect. People sued to put that on hold. And under the Biden administration, just recently, the decision was made to not fight that lawsuit. And that means that they took the sort of easiest path to restoring us back to previous guidance that's been in place since 1999. That takes us back to where we were and should settle people's fears about things and changes. What it doesn't do is get rid of public charge as a bar, as a barrier. The United States law still does not want poor people to come to the United States. That is our public policy. So it doesn't get rid of that, but it restores us back to a level we've been operating in for a long time, and is a really positive development for making sure people in this time of COVID especially are seeking out what they need to make themselves safe and well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. If there are questions about public charge, I know, Michelle, you can answer a couple. I'd also want to mention that there's an organization called Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, which has a 1-800 number hotline where people can ask specific questions that they may have about public charge. So perhaps with the couple of minutes that we have left for this portion of our conversation, you can talk a little bit about the bills that are pending at the federal legislative level, or pull out one or two that you think might be most relevant to discuss. I know that there's a lot of activity this week.
Yeah, there certainly has been no shortage of legislative proposals going into Congress. One that people probably noticed, it was announced by the administration on its first day and finally did get introduced, the U.S. Citizenship Act, HR 1177. That would be a restructuring of many of our immigration laws. And that's the president's bill that's out there. Obviously, he's not sponsoring it. He's no longer in Congress, but that's the bill that the administration's put forward. And it's got a lot of provisions in it. It does a lot of good things. But one that's really kind of rhetorical, but I think important, is a definitional change. That is getting rid of the word alien from our definitions of our immigration law definitions. Right now, anybody who's not a citizen is officially an alien in the United States, and this would change that term to non-citizen. I think public policy is reflected in the words that we use in it, and while that's a rhetorical thing, it's definitely something worth noting. The bills that we're really looking forward or looking at, one is the New Way Forward Act. That would dismantle a lot of the entanglement of our criminal enforcement system and our immigration enforcement system, get rid of mandatory detention laws, really do some structural change to the immigration system. That is HR 536. Today, the Dream and Promise Act passed, and I think, let me just get the vote. Dream and Promise Act passed the House with all Democrats voting and 9 Republicans voting, so it was 228 to 197. The Dream and Promise Act has a sort of that path to citizenship for dreamers and others, but it has come with some controversy, and I think this is something that you'll see throughout a number of the bills, that it continues to rely on bars based on criminal activity. So people who have been convicted of crimes will not be eligible for green cards, even if they've been here for long periods of time, have lived their whole life here, all of these things that we think of when we think of the dreamers. It has continued to have this good immigrant, bad immigrant dichotomy that communities are really pushing back against. And it's introducing, I think, a new frame for us, and a question of why we deport people who've committed or been convicted of crimes in the United States at all. That's something that is starting to become part of the conversation, and restoring, at the very least, some discretion, but maybe thinking about a new way to define who's in and who's out when it comes to our immigration laws. So.
Thank you. That's wonderful, Michelle. And so I just want to open things up for a question, because I promised if there are questions, please ask. If there are no questions, we're just going to push through on state legislative and additional issues. But want to make sure and respect the audience, that if people have questions that they'd like to ask Michelle, or insights that they'd like to share regarding your own experiences or your own work, please do feel free to put it in the chat, or just, unmute yourself and start talking. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a quick question of Michelle, is what she thinks will happen with the legislation that just passed the House and the US Senate.
I don't know. I mean, I don't have a good read. I think this is one that could move forward. There's been a lot of work on this, and the bill number is HR 6, by the way, for those of you scoring at home, if you want to be watching. I don't know what the horse trading is. There are so many bills in play, one of which is the president's bill. And so where will things go? But I think as an advocacy community, we're getting much more comfortable with the idea of fixing some of the problems that we can fix right out of the gate, rather than waiting for what has been for 20 years, this comprehensive immigration reform, commitment that we weren't going to let pieces be shaved off. So I would expect it could move ahead, which would be great. It's long past time to start making sure that we can stabilize communities and give people a way to plan their lives. We just need to be thinking about, the big picture on all of that and what's the trade-off. This year, we haven't seen the bills introduced have the toxic trade-off of, we will give you this little bit of legalization if in exchange for 100,000 new Border Patrol agents. That's sort of where we've been for a long time, and we're not seeing that here. So that's really good and makes this more piecemeal legislation, I think, possible for community to sign on to. So.
That's wonderful, Michelle. It's a very exciting place to be. I do see it looks like someone's typing, but I am just going to transition us briefly to state-related measures. There's so much exciting stuff happening at the state legislature that impacts immigrant, refugee, and new American communities. And Michelle, if you could kind of take us through, you can share bill numbers too if you'd like, but just sort of walk us through some of the initiatives that are at the state legislature briefly?
Sure. And one thing about the state legislature and city government alongside the federal government to remember is that people's lived experience and lived lives are in our local communities. And so this, this isn't just a matter for the federal government to fix. And it's not just a matter of, making sure that people have and access to a green card, because we have so many systems within our state law that propel people into, situations where they won't be eligible for a green card. We have inequities that in policing, we have inequities in and racism in how people are, viewed when they're living without housing, or, when they have mental health crises that get them into a system that criminalizes them and then makes them ineligible for things like the Dream and Promise Act, right? So the state law, the city actions all make a real difference, and it's tempting to think we have chance in Congress to fix immigration. We can not worry about it so much on the local level, and they just go hand in hand. So really, I'm glad to see a few things in particular at the state legislature this year. One is a bill that makes a one-day change. This is, I think, my favorite, most elegant piece of legislation out there. Right now, Minnesota defines a gross misdemeanor as a crime for which you can be sentenced to 365 days in jail. And that, the proposal on the table is to make that defined as 364 days in jail, taking away one day, but allowing that conviction to not be defined as an aggravated felony under federal immigration law. This one day makes it possible for people to have to state a case in deportation hearings and say, look at my life, and give some discretion. If you're convicted of an aggravated felony, you're pretty much out of any defenses to being deported. By changing our definition by one day, we can make a huge difference in who is really under mandatory detention and deportation laws and who has a fair day in court. So I think that is just should be a no-brainer for us here in Minnesota. The bill numbers there are HF 614 and SF 901. I think that looks like something that can move, and it should be a priority. That's something that just needs to happen here for us. Another piece of legislation addresses victims of crimes. And some of you may have heard of the U visa crime victim legislation. Oh, I just got a note that the farm workforce bill also passed the legislature at the House. So that's the bell that's coming up that you can hear. It's somebody messaging me legislative introductions. But the victims of serious crimes in the United States who aren't citizens often fear, with good reason, going to police to get help because they themselves can become the target of deportation. They can get turned over to immigration authorities. They can be, kind of be surfaced as being here undocumented. And that makes undocumented folks really, targets for predation.
Yep, in some communities, right? So in the city of Minneapolis, I think it's important to highlight that we do have a separation ordinance that, prevents law enforcement from communicating or requesting information about immigration status or working in conjunction with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And in addition, the city of Minneapolis does have a U visa ordinance where victims of crime can obtain a law enforcement certification through the police department and other entities. However, this protection doesn't exist statewide.
Right, and modeling on Minneapolis's U visa law ordinance, this state law would allow people to have a predictable process for getting certifications they need to get this crime victim protection. It's important, I think Minneapolis's ordinance showed the power of just saying, this is our policy, and the ability to communicate to community with a strong, unwavering voice, right? You're not going to be retaliated against if you file this. You're not going to be picked up and turned over to immigration if you call the police for help. You'll be able to do this. We want to see the same thing statewide so that crime victims can, access the protection they need. And so that bill also has been moved. I think it's on the general register now at the legislature, so it's moved very nicely along. But that's another piece of dismantling this criminal intersection that can really impact immigrant communities. And probably the big one on everybody's, radar for years now has been access to driver's licenses for people. If you're as old as me, you remember we did have driver's license access for people regardless of citizenship status. You had to prove you were a Minnesota resident and who you were to get a state ID or driver's license. That changed back in 2003 and has been boxed into a corner legislatively over the past few years. And a bill is again pending to restore driver's license access to people. HF 1163 was introduced. I really hope that this can be something that doesn't get bargained away at the last minute. It's something that is incredibly important for not just the practical reality of being able to drive, but for the message of being included as a member in our community. So, being excluded from official documentation is really powerful, and it's a powerful statement of exclusion. So hopefully that will be something that we can see move this year as well.
And I know that there are a few more, and I'm not sure if you can take a couple of minutes. There's the Minnesota Care for All and post-conviction relief. So
right.
I think that's everything.
Yeah, post-conviction relief means going back and getting your conviction for a crime really removed as though it never happened. Not just saying that it's off your record, but that it never legally happened. Minnesota has an extremely restrictive law nationwide. We're one of the most narrow post-conviction relief states. You have a very limited time period to challenge convictions, very narrow circumstances. And this has left, it's hit communities who have not been able to be deported really hard, right? So here's the scenario. For a number of Southeast Asian countries in particular, the US doesn't have diplomatic relationships with those countries. So Vietnam, we didn't for a while, a long time. Laos and Cambodia, for obvious political reasons. This was, we're not in conversation. People from those countries would get ordered deported. Their countries would say, you can't land a plane here. We're not accepting people back for deportation. Folks who got ordered deported 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago have been living here sort of post order of deportation in limbo, right? And the US government can pick them up and take them at any point if their country will accept them back for deportation. That has meant that people with very old convictions have recently can find out that there's going to be an impact of those convictions in their lives, and they'll be deported. But it's too late under Minnesota's criminal statutes to go back and undo that conviction. So this law, and it's HF 833, would just extend the window of time for people to file those challenges. They still have to have some other reason why the conviction wasn't valid, but it would extend that window and make sure people would have a day in court, would be able to go back into the immigration court and not be stuck with an old deportation order. It's such a tiny group of folks who are affected by this, and it's such a huge life impact on those people. This just is, again, sort of the right thing to do. There have been some hearings on it, and some of the people on both sides of the aisle have raised their hands and said, what's happening right now? How are people being affected? How can we stop this? It really is unjust that people don't have a way to go back and challenge those convictions.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. And then the last one, really the Minnesota Care for All, I think is especially important considering the effects of the pandemic, lack of access to healthcare. So if you could just give a quickie on what that.
It really just makes sure that people are eligible for public healthcare options, and it regardless of immigration status, doesn't carve out undocumented folks from that. This is, we have seen the perils in people's lives of having some people who are in and some people who are not in in our safety net when we all live in community together. We're depending on people to produce our food and to, deliver it to our homes and to make sure our family members in nursing homes are taken care of. And these essential workers have been excluded from the protections that that they most need. It's just wrong. And so making sure that healthcare access is open to people regardless of documentation, I think is like the first step of many that we need to take on that.
Thank you, Michelle. And if people are interested in supporting these bills or learning more about these measures at the state legislature, what would you suggest? How can they become more informed? How can they advocate if they're interested in supporting these measures?
Yeah, I think on the state level, we are so close to our representative and senator in our districts. So it is, and I see my husband just got home, so we may have a barking dog in the background. He gets very excited sorry. People can contact our state elected officials so easily. I know Becky has the current contact information for this neighborhood's folks here. Looking at Scott and Frank, these people are like, they really have immigrant protection and community engagement at heart, but that doesn't mean they don't need to hear from you, and that they don't need to hear that, they're making the right call by moving forward on the driver's license bill. Both have been very, very significantly involved in that fight over the years. Giving them, like letting them know you support that is really important. So please do go ahead and give people a call. I think if you've, I'm guessing that folks on this event here have probably called your state legislators in the past once or twice. They may know your phone numbers already, recognize them, but don't just rest on that. I mean, they have to hear from us and know that they're doing the right thing on these. So
Thank you for that. And I wonder whether, you know, kind of turning to the last subject that we wanted to address, which is ways that people can get involved in immigration advocacy and supporting immigrant, refugee, and new American communities. And I know that the Advocates has a very robust avenue for support if people are interested in volunteering. So would you mind sharing some of the opportunities that might be available that the Advocates can help connect people to?
Absolutely. I think I should ask the group, if anybody, if you want to raise your hand, if anyone is currently a volunteer with the Advocates for Human Rights. That often happens. We have a number of areas. Last year, we involved over 1,300 volunteers, mostly in Minnesota, but in communities around the country and around the world in working on human rights issues with this idea that when we are engaged in human rights work, we move from being a bystander to activist, and we really can all build the human rights movement together in that. One of the things that we've done since 1983, 1984 has been legal defense of asylum seekers. And so if anybody is or knows a licensed attorney and would be interested in volunteering to represent someone, we recruit and train and support people to actually take on an asylum case, representing somebody in their claim to seek protection in the United States because they're afraid of persecution on account of their identity. The immigration law is, you know, relatively simple in the asylum world for an attorney, but it's exponentially more difficult for our asylum seekers to navigate on their own. There's no right to counsel in the United States for immigrants who are going through deportation proceedings, no right to counsel for people seeking asylum. That means that, you know, really a lot of people face these complicated forms. They face the filing process. They face a hearing or an interview with no one by their side. The asylum application is, you know, I think about 15 pages long now. Sometimes we do that in pig Latin in trainings to, you know, with people like, you try to fill this out. It's hard, right? When you don't speak English as your first language or your literacy level is low. So if you're an attorney and want to help, we do have training all the time. We have cases going on, and we anticipate based on past experience that we're going to see a lot more kiddos needing representation. We don't have a right to counsel for anybody. That means that children, if they can't find a free lawyer, or if their families can't hire a lawyer, they speak for themselves in court. It's absurd, it's horrifying, but it happens. And so we really welcome people who are interested in engaging in that work to just get in touch with us and on board. So that's one area. Mm-hmm.
And just, you know, speaking from experience, working as a volunteer or taking on an asylum applicant is really a life-changing experience and a career-changing experience. I know it has been personally for me. I know that there are many other opportunities, including as court observers, and I know that you recently did a report on the court observation project. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that too.
Sure. Well, some of you may know a program called Watch. Women at the Courthouse started more than 20 years ago in Minneapolis as a court monitoring program. And Watch really kind of used a core human rights methodology of being present in a court to guarantee the right to a fair public trial and to monitor what's going on in proceedings. Watch was focused on gender-based violence cases. And as it's something that we've always been aware of at the Advocates, that project going on, right? So as the mobilization back in 2017 at the airport happened, when people turned out at the airports to both protest the travel bans that had been put into effect and to offer help, to try to help people who were affected by the bans, that energy was so overwhelming that the collaborative of folks who were heading that up, we started a court observation project, thinking if we can, just monitor what's going on in immigration court, get people out there to see what goes on inside the machinery of deportation and detention, that would both inform people and provide some protection for those who are going through the system and help us monitor what's happening. So we started that in mid-2017. To date, we've had over 700 individual volunteers participate in the project. And I can't remember, I can't remember the thousands of individual hearings that we've monitored. We've been able to produce sort of regular periodic reports on what's going on in immigration court. We have also documented the impact on volunteers and the system, and kind of defining what is the right thing. What do people think should happen in a deportation hearing? And put out a report in December called Bearing Witness in the Moment that really captured some of the volunteers' experiences and observations around how we should structure deportation hearings, what makes sense and what doesn't. People were, they identified you need a lawyer. Like that's how a fair hearing happens. You need to not be shackled so you can't take notes. All of these really common sense and very profound observations. And then as COVID has played out in the immigration system, we continued to see people held in detention, which is in jails, in a number of county jails throughout Minnesota, just waiting essentially to get sick because ICE would not release them under these draconian policies they had. And people having to appear in immigration court, by video and not having access to attorneys or the information they needed to actually make a defense, and the impact on their health and well-being and on their ability to have a fair day in court led us to compile those findings. We released just a few weeks ago on immigration detention conditions, and that's something that we hope can really not only address the issue of immigration detention, but of jail conditions themselves. Right now, Minnesota jails just have minimal oversight and supervision. We definitely need to have our laws updated on jail oversight. I believe they were written about 100 years ago, and give full discretion to the sheriffs to organize everything: healthcare delivery, access to the outdoors, all of those pieces. So people can be part of the court observation project. It's really easy. There's some orientation and training. You can get a mentor who will help you, kind of not only navigate how to get in the building and all of that, but also debrief with you. We meet regularly as a court observer team to kind of process what's going on, and we will be needing additional folks as things again open up. I mean, we've been continuing to monitor during COVID, but as the whole court system comes back online and we see these kids and families coming back into the system in massive numbers, we anticipate needing a pretty robust core of volunteers. So I know Becky's already shared that page, the volunteer engagement page, but we really welcome you. You could go one time, you can go hundreds. We've had volunteers go hundreds of times. So if you want to learn more. Oops, and you're on mute, Michelle.
Sorry. Okay, and I know that Becky also added the bearing witness report into the chat. We're at 7:26 now, and want to make sure that if people have any questions for Michelle, they can get at least maybe 1 or 2 questions in before we have to wrap up. So if you have a question, don't hesitate, just ask it now and quick.
And I will put my
Or
email.
put it in the chat. Yep.
I just had a question, Michelle. If someone is interested in doing the court observation, what is the time commitment there? So say you can do one of these cases, what should they expect?
Yeah, there is a little bit of front end orientation. So that'll take, a few hours of time, and then you can sign up for one shift. That would be usually a 2.5 hour time block. You could do that once. You could do that, once on a regular basis. So, once every other Tuesday or something. There's no minimum commitment. We're really happy to have people go one time and just see what's going on. And we're happy to have people find that that's really the place they want to spend a lot of time and really dig in and be kind of, super volunteers. People going out the first time have really profound observations. And that first trip out there is really valuable information for us. So even if it's just one time, or you can go occasionally, it doesn't have to be something that you have a regular shift for. We just fill in, you grab a shift where you can. Oh yeah, and yes, Amy Lang she is court observer at umn.edu. She's our coordinator at the project and is phenomenal. So thank you, Ileana.
Thank you. And I see Heidi has raised her hand as well. Heidi.
Hi, yes, Michelle. I just have one quick question. I am interested in volunteering as an attorney, but I am also interested in how COVID has affected that type of representation. So could you speak just for a minute as to, I know it would be difficult to kind of negotiate that during this time period. How has that been going on?
Unfortunately, cases have continued to move, even with COVID. So we have continued to have to work with clients. We have a variety of ways to do that remotely. And one of the things that's happening is statewide, there's been an investment in computer kiosks for people to use to meet with attorneys when they can't meet in person. So we have one in our office where clients can come in and scan documents and everything to get them to you. So we can really, I think, work to tailor representation so that you can work remotely with people or in person, depending on what makes sense. If everybody in your particular representation unit has been vaccinated, then you're going to move forward differently. But like all of us, our clients are adapting, and we're all getting better at talking to one another on Zoom. So we just have to keep going because our clients have to actually file their asylum applications within a year of arrival, or they lose the right to seek asylum. There's no COVID exception. So we really have had to keep going with folks. So if you're interested, get in touch with us. I put my email in the chat, and also there's the volunteer information piece that you can sign up for. And then we just figure it out on a case-by-case basis with every attorney and client team on what you need to move ahead.
So thank you. And I see we're at 7:30. So just want to say thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Becky and LHiNC, for hosting. And I'll turn it back over to Becky.
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone tonight. I wanted to let everyone here know you'll receive a follow-up email after this that'll have additional resources, links, and things that were commented on tonight, as well as some other resources that Michelle and I have talked about prior to this event. I wanted to quickly throw it back to Michelle. Was there anything else that you want, Michelle Rivero, was there anything else you wanted to let everyone know about your Office of Immigrant and Refugee Services?
I'll just say that the OIRA Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs has a webpage where you can see updates on immigration related matters and also see the links to our weekly forums on immigration development. So feel free to check out the webpage. I believe Becky will be adding that to the materials that she sends out to you afterwards. And please don't hesitate to connect with our office. Would love to hear from you. And thank you so much for your interest in being here today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, both Michelles. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. And I will hope to see you all soon, maybe in person. Okay.
Bye. Thanks
Thank
again.
you all.